Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a slow and sandy journey into one of history's quietest wonders. A city at the edge of the Sahara where books were treated like treasure, scholars were more admired than kings, and knowledge traveled across the desert beside salt and gold. Picture this. You're somewhere deep in the Sahara Desert. The sun is fading behind the dunes, turning the sand a soft, dusty gold. A long line of camels moves steadily across the horizon, swaying like giant metronomes beneath the evening sky. You walk beside them. Your sandals are full of sand. Your skin is sticky with sweat, and you're beginning to question every life decision that brought you here. This journey is not exactly luxurious, unless, of course, you enjoy salted fish, camel milk, and walking 15 miles a day beneath a blazing desert sun. So, before we continue, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet history journeys. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little caravan travels. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some soft background noise. Settle comfortably beneath your blankets, and let's slowly wander into the story of Timbuktu, the forgotten book capital of the Sahara. You are part of a caravan crossing the Sahara sometime during the 13th century. The wind is dry and scratchy, like an old wool blanket dragged across your skin. Every footstep crunches softly in the sand. Around you are dozens, sometimes hundreds, of merchants, travelers, scribes, guides, and animals moving together through the endless desert. And of course, camels. Always camels. They are the engines of the Sahara, powered almost entirely by stubbornness and survival instinct. Your cargo is precious. You are hauling giant slabs of salt, cut from the mines of Tagaza and stacked carefully with ropes made from palm fiber. The blocks gleam pale beneath the desert sun, almost like pieces of frozen light. In these lands, salt is worth far more than most outsiders would ever imagine. Sometimes it is traded ounce for ounce with gold further south along the Niger River. Historians still debate whether those legendary salt for gold exchanges were exaggerated by travelers trying to impress people back home, or whether, for merchants like you, it was simply another ordinary day in the Sahara. The caravan continues southward. Days blur together beneath an endless sky. Sometimes the heat shimmers so intensely that distant dunes appear to float like islands upon the horizon. Other times, sudden winds erase the tracks behind you within moments, as though the desert wishes to keep no memory of anyone passing through it. At night, however, the Sahara becomes strangely peaceful. You sleep beneath enormous stars wrapped in rough wool blankets, while the low grunts of camels drift through the darkness. Tiny fires flicker softly between groups of travelers. Tea is poured slowly. Stories move from person to person like drifting smoke. Meals are simple. Dried dates. Flatbread hard enough to survive several centuries. Goat stew if fortune happens to smile upon you that evening. The desert teaches people not to complain too much. Among your companions is a scholar from Walata who speaks several languages and carries almost nothing except a satchel full of parchment. He claims he is traveling to a city where scholars debate beneath shaded courtyards and books are traded more carefully than jewels. You are skeptical. You have seen many mirages already, but something about the way he speaks makes the place feel real. Along the journey you pass other caravans heading northward. Their camels carry indigo cloth, gold dust sealed inside leather pouches, carved ivory, spices, and bundles of manuscripts wrapped carefully against the sand. The Sahara is not empty, it is a highway, a living network of trade routes, languages, rumors, prayers, and ideas stretching across thousands of miles. One evening, while resting beside a fire, you overhear an older merchant telling a story in a soft voice. He speaks of a city where books are worth more than camels, a place where knowledge is protected inside mud brick homes, a quiet city hidden between the dunes where scholars copy manuscripts late into the night while the desert wind whispers outside their windows. The name sounds almost musical when he says it. Timbuktu. You have heard the word before, but only in fragments and half-remembered conversations. Some claim it began as a temporary camp for nomads. Others say it was founded beside a well guarded by a woman named Buktu. Historians still debate exactly how Timbuktu truly began. But in every version of the story, books somehow find their way into the legend. Books wrapped in leather, books filled with astronomy, poetry, medicine, law, and philosophy. Books copied carefully by hand beneath flickering oil lamps. As the fire burns lower, you begin imagining the city, palm trees swaying gently beside earth-colored walls, narrow streets glowing softly beneath the lantern light, scholars with ink-stained fingers leaning over parchment while distant prayers echo across the rooftops. And then, several days later, you finally see it. At first, it barely appears at all. Low shapes rise from the horizon, almost invisible within the heat haze. The buildings are the same color as the surrounding dunes, as though the city itself has grown naturally from the desert floor. Your camel grunts unimpressed, but beside you, the scholar from Walata slowly smiles. Timbuktu, he whispers quietly. The city does not rise dramatically like a jewel. It melts into the Sahara. As you approach, you begin noticing movement. Children laughing, traders unloading goods, fabric fluttering softly in the wind. There is a calm rhythm here, not fast, not loud, alive, but patient. You pass beneath a wooden gate and enter narrow streets lined with sun-baked mud brick buildings. The air smells faintly of dust, roasted grain, ink, and warm earth, and for reasons you cannot fully explain, it already feels strangely familiar. The first thing you notice about Timbuktu is how quiet it feels. Not silent, just deliberate. The kind of quiet that belongs to places where people already know what they are doing and feel no need to rush. You wander slowly through the narrow streets. The buildings lean gently toward one another like old companions. Their walls are made from banko, a mixture of sun-dried mud and straw reinforced with long wooden beams that jut outward like ribs. In the warm afternoon light, the surfaces almost seem soft. These walls absorb the brutal heat during the day and slowly release it back into the air at night. It feels as though the entire city is breathing around you. You duck beneath a low wooden archway and step into a small marketplace. But this market feels different from others you have visited. There is no shouting, no frantic bargaining, no crashing metal or chaotic noise. Instead, everything moves in calm murmurs. Fabric merchants carefully unroll deep indigo cloth across wooden tables. Spice sellers gesture lazily over baskets filled with cardamom, ginger, and dried herbs. Dates are stacked everywhere in neat little towers that glow amber beneath the sunlight. A smiling child presses one into your hand before disappearing back into the crowd without saying a word. Timbuktu welcomes people quietly. You learn that centuries earlier, this place was little more than a seasonal camp beside a well. Nomadic Tuareg groups stopped here while crossing the desert. According to tradition, a woman named Buktu may have watched over the camp and guarded the water supply. Over time, travelers began calling the settlement Timbuktu, the place of Buktu, Historians still argue over whether she was a real person or simply part of the city's mythology. But you'd like the idea of an ancient center of learning being named after a woman, with enough practical sense to manage a desert well. In the beginning, Timbuktu was not a city. It was simply useful. Positioned near the great bend of the Niger River, it sat perfectly between northern caravan routes and the kingdoms farther south. Salt from the Sahara arrived here. Gold from West Africa arrived here. And eventually, scholars arrived too. What began as tents slowly became mud houses, then mosques, then schools, then libraries. Over generations, the temporary settlement transformed into something permanent. You stop beside an old well said to date back centuries. Children splash water along its edges, while an elderly man lowers a bucket carefully into the darkness below. The rope creaks softly as it descends. When the bucket returns, he offers you a drink. The water tastes of minerals, earth, and patience. Timbuktu does not feel ancient in the dramatic way ruined empires do. It feels lived in, layered. Archaeologists have uncovered pottery fragments, cooking pits, and traces of homes buried beneath the city streets. For hundreds of years, people have eaten, argued, studied, traded, prayed, and tried unsuccessfully to avoid the desert heat in these same narrow alleys. You pass an old caravanserai, once used by traveling merchants. Its wooden beams still carry faded carvings and fragments of Arabic script hidden beneath cracked plaster. Perhaps prayers, perhaps poetry, or perhaps simply the ancient equivalent of someone doodling camels while bored during a long meeting. Nearby, you glimpse a courtyard garden hidden behind tall walls. Neem trees sway gently above clay water jars. A young woman quietly recites verses from memory while an elderly relative listens nearby. Here, learning is not locked away inside institutions. It spills naturally into daily life. A boy rushes past, carrying a bundle of parchment beneath one arm and roasted yam beneath the other. He is likely on his way to study with one of the city's scholars. There are no formal classrooms as you might imagine them. Lessons take place beneath shaded porches, inside courtyards, or beneath trees where students gather around teachers seated on woven mats. There are no printed textbooks, only memory, repetition, and the soft rustle of turning pages. In Timbuktu, scholars are treated almost like celebrities, not warriors, not kings, but people capable of quoting poetry while calmly preparing tea. You hear stories of famous scholars whose personal libraries contained hundreds, even thousands, of manuscripts. One name appears again and again in conversation. Ahmad, a scholar so devoted to books that when he was later exiled from the city, people claimed he mourned the loss of his manuscripts more deeply than the loss of his own freedom. As evening slowly settles across Timbuktu, shadows stretch longer across the mud-brick walls. Oil lamps begin glowing softly inside doorways. Somewhere nearby, a scribe prepares fresh ink from soot and tree gum. You find a quiet place beside a half-buried bench and sit for a while in silence. The city hums gently around you. Someone laughs softly in the distance. A child briefly cries before being comforted. A bell rings somewhere beyond the rooftops. Timbuktu is not flashy. It does not try to overwhelm you. It simply exists as a place where words matter deeply, and silence itself feels welcoming. You close your eyes for a moment beneath the cooling desert air. Tomorrow, perhaps, you will visit the great mosques and libraries. But tonight, you are content simply listening to the city breathe. Morning in Timbuktu begins softly, not with loud bells or crowded streets, but with the gentle scrape of brooms against packed earth, quiet morning prayers drifting through open courtyards, and the steady shuffle of sandals across warm sand. The desert air is cooler now. A brief moment of mercy before the Sahara once again stretches its burning arms across the city. You wake early and wander toward the center of Timbuktu, without any real destination in mind. A rooster crows somewhere nearby with very little enthusiasm. Women carrying baskets atop their heads move gracefully through the streets, while merchants begin unfolding cloth and opening market stalls. No one seems rushed, and yet somehow, everything happens exactly when it should. Eventually your steps lead you towards. You have heard the name whispered repeatedly since arriving in the city. Part mosque, part school, part intellectual lighthouse rising quietly from the desert itself. Its mud-brick minaret stands above the surrounding rooftops like a patient finger pointing toward the heavens. Unlike the great stone cathedrals of Europe, Sankore is not decorated with gold or towering stained glass, but it radiates something else: purpose. The kind of place that silently says, what happens here matters. You remove your sandals and step inside. The interior is cool and dim. Thin beams of sunlight filter through narrow openings high above, painting long golden lines across the floor. The air smells faintly of dust, parchment, and ink. Students sit cross-legged on woven mats, gently rocking back and forth as they memorize passages. Some whisper verses beneath their breath. Others copy text carefully onto wooden slates, while teachers move quietly among them, correcting mistakes with calm patience. This is not simply religious study. Here, students learn theology, law, astronomy, mathematics, grammar, philosophy, and medicine. The pages around you contain discussions of stars, trade routes, inheritance law, planetary movement, and questions about morality that scholars have debated for centuries. One young student proudly shows you a page he has copied by hand. It concerns inheritance law, written in elegant flowing Arabic script. You nod respectfully, as though you fully understand it. You absolutely do not. But the handwriting is beautiful. Historians still debate whether places like Sankore should truly be considered universities in the modern sense. There were no printed diplomas, no graduation ceremonies, no crowded bookstores selling overpriced robes and questionable snacks. And yet, by the standards of intellectual influence, Timbuktu stood among the great centers of learning in the medieval world. Some scholars later compared it to Oxford or Cairo. You settle quietly into a corner and observe the lessons continuing round you. A girl no older than 12 recites a passage about planetary movement while her teacher softly corrects her pronunciation. She repeats the lines patiently until finally she gets them right. A bright smile spreads across her face. Nearby, another student struggles with geometry while muttering under his breath, like a man attempting to negotiate with invisible spirits. Knowledge here is not rushed. It is repeated carefully until it settles permanently into memory. You learn that Timbuktu's libraries are scattered throughout the city rather than gathered into a single grand building. Books are stored inside family homes, hidden within private collections, sealed inside wooden chests, or tucked safely into mud-brick rooms, protected from heat and sand. There may be thousands of manuscripts in the city, possibly hundreds of thousands. No one seems entirely certain. You are eventually invited into one such private library by an elderly scholar seated outside a modest doorway sipping tea. He nods politely and gestures for you to enter. Inside, shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling. Books are everywhere, wrapped carefully in cloth, bound with leather, stacked inside clay jars, tied together with faded cords. The room smells of old paper, dust, leather, and time itself. The scholar opens one manuscript carefully in front of you. The leather cover cracks softly as delicate pages reveal diagrams of medicinal herbs and handwritten notes discussing treatments for fever, liver pain, and disturbing dreams involving too many scorpions. Practical medical advice. With a touch of medieval uncertainty, you browse other texts, poetry, astronomy, philosophy, essays debating whether wind possesses moral character, historical works filled with notes written by generations of readers in crowded margins. The pages feel alive, not frozen in history, but still participating in an ongoing conversation. You ask the old scholar whether books are sold often in Timbuktu. He smiles slowly. For the right price, he says. Then after a pause he adds, though sometimes knowledge chooses its own owner. Before you leave, he hands you a small folded parchment. On it is written a simple proverb. The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. You tuck the parchment carefully into your satchel. Outside, the evening call to prayer begins echoing softly across the city. Children continue playing in dusty streets, while scribes light lamps inside small workshops. You sit once more beside the mosque as darkness slowly settles over Timbuktu. In this city, books are not decorations. They are inheritance, protection, memory, and beneath the endless stars of the Sahara. You begin to understand why generations of people crossed deserts simply for the chance to study here. The next morning, you wake to the scent of ink, not dust, not camel, not smoke from cooking fires, ink rich and earthy, with a faint metallic sharpness lingering in the air like wet stone after rain. Curious, you follow the smell through a narrow alley near the market until you arrive at a small workshop with wooden shutters thrown open to the morning sun. Inside, rows of scribes sit hunched over low desks while reed pens scratch steadily across parchment. The sound is strangely soothing, soft, rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like rain tapping gently against a distant window. A teenage apprentice notices you standing at the doorway and gestures politely toward an empty stool. His hands are stained dark with indigo ink. Judging by the smell, they may also contain traces of breakfast. Here in Timbuktu, books are not merely read. They are handcrafted into existence. You sit quietly and watch. One elderly scribe carefully traces flowing Arabic letters along the edge of a page with astonishing precision. His hands barely tremble despite decades of work. The tools around him are simple. Reed pens, inkstones, small bowls filled with soot mixed with gum, Arabic, and plant oils, sheets of imported paper and parchment prepared from animal hide. Nothing here feels rushed. Each page is treated almost like a sacred object. The manuscripts are assembled in small bundles of folded pages called quires, sewn together carefully by hand and wrapped in leather covers dyed with natural pigments. Some are plain and practical. Others are decorated so beautifully they resemble pieces of art more than books. One apprentice hands you a finished page, still warm from the sunlight. The script flows across it like waves upon water. Tiny notes curl through the margins. Commentaries twist around the main text like quiet conversations between generations of scholars. And in one corner, someone has drawn a very small cat. You are not entirely sure whether this was officially approved, or simply the work of a bored apprentice trying to survive a long afternoon. Either way, it makes you smile. Historians still argue about exactly how many manuscripts once existed in Timbuktu. Some estimates suggest 100,000. Others claim there may have been more than 700,000 texts spread throughout the city. Whatever the true number may be, one thing becomes obvious very quickly. Timbuktu was not simply preserving knowledge, it was producing it. Books here were copied, translated, debated, corrected, expanded, and passed between scholars across generations. This was no silent archive gathering dust. It was a living machine of ideas. One scribe proudly shows you his newest project, a legal manuscript explaining inheritance law for village judges, written in a local dialect using Arabic script. Even goats deserve proper inheritance records, he jokes. Then he quietly admits he is also writing commentary notes because the original author was extremely intelligent, but terrible at explaining things. You spend hours moving between work tables listening to scribes debate punctuation and pronunciation with surprising intensity. One calligrapher criticizes another's handwriting by claiming his letters curve like exhausted noodles. The insult somehow feels scholarly. Another elderly scribe carefully scrapes away a tiny mistake using a knife so sharp it hums softly against the parchment. Precision matters deeply here. These are not simply people with elegant handwriting. They are engineers of memory. You eventually ask what happens when mistakes appear in a manuscript. The entire room laughs. There are always mistakes, one scribe replies. That is why many manuscripts include colophons, little notes written at the end explaining who copied the text, where it was completed, and sometimes how miserable the scribe felt during the process. One man proudly recites his favorite example, finished during the 5th day of fasting. The ink dried too quickly. May Allah forgive the smudges. As afternoon light fills the workshop, a delivery boy arrives carrying a stack of cloth-wrapped books destined for a scholar across town. You ask him how long books survive in Timbuktu. He shrugs. A prayer book, forever. A weather calendar, until the next flood. A love poem, until it finally works. Nearby, another manuscript lies open, displaying medical diagrams and herbal treatments for snake bites, fever, and exhaustion. One margin note suggests crocodile dung as sunscreen. You decide not to test this particular scientific theory. The shelves surrounding the workshop are organized by subject rather than author. Astronomy, trade agreements, dream interpretation, poetry for surviving sandstorms, legal disputes, agriculture. Every corner of life seems to exist somewhere inside these pages. As evening approaches, candles are lit throughout the room. The scratching of pens slows into a calm collective rhythm, while one scribe reads passages aloud so others can catch errors. Even without understanding every word, the language itself feels musical. Warm vowels drifting gently through the workshop like a lullaby. You think about the thousands of hands that touched these manuscripts before. You scholars, students, collectors, travelers, smugglers, dreamers, people who believed that writing something down gave it the power to outlive time itself. Outside, the desert night settles quietly over Timbuktu. Inside, the scribes continue working beneath flickering lamps while the city slowly drifts toward sleep. And somewhere within the margins of a manuscript, a tiny ink-drawn cat appears to be yawning too. The following morning begins with a gentle knock at your door. When you open it, a young boy stands outside holding a small clay jug and a folded piece of parchment. He grins proudly, revealing a missing front tooth. For the guest who asks too many questions, he says, you thank him and unfold the note carefully. It is an invitation. Someone named Ahmad Baba wishes to meet you. Now, in another century, Perhaps you would search his name instantly on a glowing screen. You might skim through articles while drinking coffee and pretend you fully understood everything within 5 minutes. But here in Timbuktu, knowledge travels differently. It moves through whispers, through stories, through reputation carried carefully from one scholar to another. And according to everyone you ask, Ahmad Baba is no ordinary scholar. Some claim he memorized the entire Quran at a young age. Others insist his personal library contains more than 1,600 manuscripts, an almost unbelievable number for the 16th century. Whatever the truth may be, curiosity quickly overcomes caution. His home is modest but elegant. Mud brick walls, heavy wooden beams, quiet shaded corridors that keep the desert heat outside. A young student greets you respectfully and leads you through a narrow hallway into a courtyard lined with shelves. Books, of course, everywhere. Some are wrapped carefully in cloth. Others are stacked neatly inside carved wooden boxes. One manuscript even carries the faint scent of cinnamon, as though centuries of spice. Traders somehow settled permanently into its pages. Then Ahmad Baba enters the courtyard. He moves calmly, robes flowing softly behind him like turning pages in the wind. His eyes are sharp but kind, the sort of eyes that seem capable of reading both books and people equally well. Without ceremony, he sits across from you and asks a question immediately. What is the purpose of a book that nobody reads? You hesitate before answering something vague about preservation. He nods thoughtfully and pours tea. What follows is not exactly a lesson, nor entirely a conversation. It drifts somewhere between philosophy and storytelling while warm desert air moves gently through the courtyard. Ahmad Baba speaks about justice often, about law, about responsibility, about how knowledge can protect people or manipulate them. He explains that books are not valuable merely because they survive. They matter because they shape the minds of those who read them. At one point he retrieves a manuscript written during his exile in Morocco after political authorities accused him of encouraging rebellion. This, he says softly while tapping the cover, is how you argue with kings without losing your head. Historians still debate exactly how politically involved Ahmad Baba truly was. Some describe him as a quiet intellectual. Others portray him as a scholar deeply critical of unjust rulers. But listening to him now, one thing feels obvious. He believed knowledge should serve ordinary people, not simply the powerful. You ask him quietly about the rumors spreading through the city, the whispers about raids, confiscated manuscripts, families hiding books behind walls and beneath floors. For the first time, he grows silent for a while. Then he sighs. Empires change, he says. Kings become afraid. Books are buried. Libraries burn. He pauses and looks toward the shelves surrounding the courtyard. But ideas... A small smile appears on his face. They behave like seeds. The conversation continues long into the afternoon. Students drift quietly through the courtyard carrying ink pots and rolled parchments. Tea is refilled endlessly. Somewhere beyond the walls, the distant sound of goats and market sellers drifts through the warm air. Before you leave, Ahmad Baba hands you a narrow scroll tied carefully with cord. Do not copy this with ink, he tells you. Copy it with memory. Inside is a short poem. The desert keeps what the wind forgets. Words buried bloom when silence rests. A scholar sleeps, but thought does not. One voice fades. 1,000 are caught. You read the lines twice, then carefully tuck the scroll inside your sash. As you step back into the streets of Timbuktu, the city feels slightly different now. Quieter, more cautious. You notice locked doors where there were none before. Conversations stop abruptly when strangers pass nearby. Families move through the streets, carrying bundles wrapped carefully in cloth, books, hidden, protected, smuggled, quietly through the city like precious treasure. Later that evening, you sit with a small group of students reviewing manuscripts beneath lantern light. One young woman carefully unfolds a fragile page inherited from her grandfather. The edges are worn thin from generations of handling. It tells when to plant millet, she explains softly. But now, it reminds me when to study. You ask whether she has ever copied it. She shakes her head immediately. If they find one copy, she whispers, they will search for more. Night slowly settles across Timbuktu. The air cools. Lanterns flicker. Somewhere in the darkness, a scribe continues writing while much of the city sleeps. And beneath mud-brick homes throughout Timbuktu, hidden safely behind walls and under floors, entire libraries wait silently in the dark, patiently surviving history. You wake before sunrise to the distant sound of camel bells drifting softly through the streets of Timbuktu. The city is already stirring. Merchants prepare bundles. Porters tighten ropes around cargo. Camels groan dramatically as though personally offended by the existence of labor. Today, your wandering leads you toward the great Caravan district, the place where Timbuktu connects itself to the wider world. Because this city was never only about books. It was also about movement, trade, travel, exchange, a crossroads where knowledge journeyed beside salt, gold, spices, textiles, and stories carried across thousands of miles of desert. You arrive near the caravanserai, just as a massive caravan prepares to depart northward. The sight is astonishing. Camels stretch across the horizon in long, uneven lines, their saddlebags filled with salt slabs, manuscripts, dyed cloth, dried fish, and leather goods. Some caravans contain hundreds of animals, others more than 1,000. At that point, it feels less like transportation and more like a very determined parade of irritated camels. A weathered trader named Bakari invites you to sit beside a small fire while tea is prepared. His face is shaped by decades of desert wind. His voice sounds like rough cloth dragged slowly across stone. Over tiny cups of painfully strong mint tea, he explains the desert routes connecting Timbuktu to cities like Tagaza, Gao, Cairo, Fez, and Marrakesh. We travel mostly at night, he says. The sun cooks your thoughts during the day. He pauses before adding, and sometimes your backside too. You nod sympathetically. Bakari explains that salt mined deep within the Sahara remains one of the most valuable resources in West Africa. Entire communities farther south depend on it for preserving food and surviving the humid climate. Huge slabs are carved directly from the desert floor and transported slowly across the sands. Gold moves north, salt moves south, and between them, Timbuktu thrives. Historians still debate whether Timbuktu became famous primarily because of trade or because of scholarship. But sitting here among merchants, scribes, camel drivers, and travelers from countless regions, the distinction suddenly feels unimportant. In Timbuktu, commerce and knowledge are deeply connected. A merchant might carry legal texts beside spices. A scholar might travel with caravan guards while debating astronomy beneath the stars. A trader arriving from Morocco could bring not only silk and silver, but news, rumors, scientific ideas, and philosophical arguments. Ideas travel surprisingly well on camelback. You wander deeper into the market district where salt slabs are stacked carefully like pale stone bricks. Children chip smaller pieces away, using metal tools, while merchants argue prices in several different languages: Arabic, Songhai, Tamashek, and others you cannot recognize. The market feels alive without becoming chaotic. A goat escapes from somewhere and immediately begins eating part of a merchant's turban. Nobody appears especially surprised. Nearby, elderly men sit together drinking tamarind juice beneath a shaded awning. One gestures for you to join them. They explain how Timbuktu taxes caravans passing through the city, taking payment in cloth, salt, gold, or livestock. A fair price, one man says, for water, safety, and fewer opportunities to die in the desert. Reasonable enough. You later glimpse old trade records stored near an archive room. Some are written on parchment, others scratched into treated leather or wooden boards. One receipt lists payment as 2 goats, 1 woven rug, and half of a poem. Nobody seems entirely sure what happened to the remaining half. Of course, trade across the Sahara is not always peaceful. Empires rise and collapse. Bandits attack isolated caravans. Sandstorms erase entire routes overnight. Sometimes merchants vanish into the desert and are never seen again. Yet still, the caravans continue. They always do. As evening approaches, you join a group of travelers gathered around a fire outside the city walls. Someone taps softly on a hand drum made from stretched goatskin. Another trader sings a slow song about a camel supposedly falling in love with the moon. The melody drifts lazily into the desert night. Above you, the Sahara sky unfolds into endless stars. One old traveler traces constellations with a weathered finger while explaining how caravans navigate by the heavens themselves. The desert has no signs, he says quietly, only stories. The fire crackles softly, camels shift in the darkness, and somewhere beyond the dunes, another caravan slowly approaches Timbuktu, carrying more books, more rumors, and more stories waiting to cross the Sahara. As evening settles gently over Timbuktu, the heat finally begins to loosen its grip on the city. The streets cool slowly. Lanterns flicker awake one by one, and above the rooftops, the desert sky deepens into a rich velvet blue filled with stars so bright they almost seem close enough to touch. Tonight, you follow the sound of quiet voices toward a small open courtyard near the edge of the city. People are gathering there. Families, students, travelers, merchants returning from the market. No one appears hurried. Everyone settles carefully onto woven mats while a small fire crackles softly at the center of the courtyard. You soon realize you are attending something deeply important to Timbuktu. Storytelling, not merely entertainment, memory. An elderly poet wrapped in pale robes sits beside the fire while the crowd falls respectfully silent. His voice is low, calm, and rhythmic as he begins speaking. The stories drift through the night air like music. He tells tales of ancient kings crossing the Sahara beneath constellations no longer remembered, of scholars who carried entire libraries upon camelback, of caravans guided by stars and desert winds, of mysterious spirits said to wander the dunes, whispering forgotten languages to travelers who stayed awake too long. Every now and then the poet pauses to slip in small jokes. A forgetful scribe who accidentally copied the same page 3 times. A merchant who claimed his camel understood philosophy. A scholar who composed a poem so long that the audience fell asleep before he reached the middle. Gentle laughter moves through the crowd. Nothing feels loud here. Even joy arrives softly in Timbuktu. You begin to understand that storytelling in this city is more than passing time. It is another form of preservation. Not every piece of knowledge lives inside a manuscript. Some histories survive only because voices continue repeating them beneath the stars. Historians still debate how strongly Timbuktu's oral traditions influenced its written scholarship. But listening tonight, it becomes impossible to separate the two. The stories feed the books, and the books preserve the stories. A young student seated beside you quietly explains that many scholars first memorized long passages orally before ever writing them down. Memory itself was treated like a discipline, a sacred responsibility. The poet continues. Now he tells a story about a scholar who supposedly argued with another teacher for 7 straight days over the meaning of a single sentence. Who won? Someone asks. The old man smiles slowly. The tea seller, he replies. He sold tea to both of them the entire week. The crowd chuckles again. Nearby, a drummer taps a slow rhythm upon stretched goatskin. The beat blends softly with the crackling fire and the distant sound of evening prayers echoing across Timbuktu. For a while, nobody speaks at all. Everyone simply listens to the night. You glance upward. The Sahara sky feels endless above you. Somewhere beyond the darkness, caravans continue moving across the dunes. Somewhere nearby, scribes continue writing by candlelight. And inside mud brick homes throughout the city, manuscripts rest quietly beneath cloth and leather, waiting for future generations to discover them. The poet eventually invites members of the audience to recite short verses of their own. A young woman recites a poem about rain arriving after months of drought. A merchant shares a humorous rhyme about stubborn camels. One nervous boy forgets half his lines and receives warm applause anyway. Then unexpectedly, the poet looks toward you. The entire courtyard waits patiently. You hesitate before attempting a short verse you remember hearing earlier in the city. The desert keeps what the wind forgets. Several listeners nod approvingly. The old poet smiles. Good, he says softly. Now the words belong to you too. The fire burns lower as the night deepens. Children slowly fall asleep beside their parents. Tea grows cooler. Voices become quieter. Before the gathering finally ends, the poet offers one final thought to the crowd. In Timbuktu, he says, stories are stars. When the road grows dark, they guide us home. People rise slowly and begin disappearing into the lantern-lit streets. You remain seated for a moment longer beneath the desert sky, wrapped in warmth, in silence, in history. And as the final embers glow softly in the darkness, you realize something important. Timbuktu did not become legendary because it conquered kingdoms. It became legendary because it remembered. The next morning arrives quietly, but something in the city feels different. Not dramatic, not immediate, just slightly heavier. You notice it first in the conversations. People lower their voices when discussing certain topics. Some doors remain closed longer than usual. Students carry manuscripts wrapped more carefully beneath their robes. Timbuktu still breathes, still studies, still trades. But beneath the calm rhythm of daily life, a quiet tension has begun spreading through the city. Rumors travel faster than caravans. Whispers of invading armies, political struggles, new rulers suspicious of scholars and independent thinkers, officials searching homes for valuable manuscripts. History, you realize, rarely announces its arrival politely. Sometimes it enters softly through half-finished conversations and worried glances. You spend the day wandering through neighborhoods you have not yet explored. In one courtyard, a family carefully lowers several wrapped books into a clay storage pit beneath the floor. An elderly woman brushes sand over the hidden space, while a child watches silently nearby. The movement is practiced, as though this is not the first time knowledge has needed protection. Nearby, a young scribe quietly explains what many families are doing. Some hide books inside walls, others bury them beneath homes. Some send manuscripts secretly along caravan routes, disguised among ordinary trade goods. The goal is simple: keep the knowledge alive. Even if the city itself changes, historians still debate exactly how many manuscripts survived the political upheavals that followed Timbuktu's golden age. Some estimate tens of thousands. Others believe far more remain hidden, even today, within private family collections. Entire libraries vanished from public view for generations. Not destroyed, protected. You visit another small library tucked behind a modest wooden door. Inside, the shelves are thinner than before. Gaps remain where manuscripts once rested. The owner notices your expression. Books travel, he says quietly. Sometimes to survive. He offers you tea while explaining how families trusted certain traders to secretly transport manuscripts beyond the reach of soldiers and officials. Knowledge became contraband. A strange idea, to fear books so deeply that armies would search for them. Yet history has repeated this pattern many times. Empires often fear memory almost as much as rebellion. Later that afternoon, you sit beside several students gathered beneath an acacia tree reviewing fragments of older texts. One young man carefully copies a page discussing astronomy. Another studies legal arguments written generations earlier. A girl nearby quietly recites poetry from memory because the original manuscript has already been hidden. Words disappear more slowly inside people, she says. The sentence lingers with you long after she finishes speaking. As evening approaches, the city grows calmer. Lantern light glows softly through narrow windows. The distant call to prayer echoes across rooftops. Somewhere nearby, someone continues copying a manuscript by candlelight despite the uncertainty surrounding the city. Perhaps especially because of it, you wander toward the edge of Timbuktu where the desert begins, reclaiming the outer streets. Sand gathers against walls. Wind moves gently through abandoned corners. The Sahara waits patiently, as it always has. Civilizations rise. Empires collapse. Trade routes shift. Armies arrive and disappear. But the desert remains. And somehow, so do stories. You think again about Ahmad Baba's words. Ideas behave like seeds. Now, standing beneath the darkening sky, you finally understand. Seeds survive underground for years, sometimes generations, waiting quietly for the right conditions to return. Perhaps knowledge works the same way. Night settles fully over Timbuktu. The city becomes little more than scattered lanterns glowing softly beneath endless stars. And hidden behind walls, beneath floors, inside clay jars and wrapped carefully in cloth, thousands of manuscripts sleep quietly in the darkness, waiting patiently for future hands to open them once again. Your final morning in Timbuktu arrives quietly beneath a pale golden sky. The city is still half asleep. A few merchants slowly open their stalls. Smoke rises lazily from cooking fires. Somewhere nearby, a teacher has already begun reciting lessons to a circle of students while the desert wind drifts softly through the courtyard. You walk slowly through the familiar streets one last time. The mud brick walls glow warmly beneath the early sunlight. Wooden beams cast long shadows across narrow alleys. A donkey wanders past, carrying bundles of parchment while looking deeply unimpressed with its responsibilities. Everything feels calm, ordinary, and yet you now understand that beneath this quiet surface, Timbuktu carried something extraordinary for centuries. Not armies, not empires. Memory. You pause near Sankore Mosque again. Students sit outside reviewing notes, while scribes prepare fresh ink nearby. The city continues doing what it has always done: teaching, copying, preserving, remembering. Even after invasions, even after political collapse, even after trade routes shifted and much of the world slowly forgot this place existed, Timbuktu endured because its people protected knowledge carefully and patiently, one manuscript at a time. Historians still debate exactly how influential Timbuktu truly was compared to other centers of learning in the medieval world. Some older European accounts exaggerated it into a mythical golden city. Others later dismissed it unfairly because they could not imagine a great intellectual center flourishing in the Sahara. But standing here now, those arguments feel strangely distant, because the truth is simpler. This city mattered deeply to the people who lived here, and perhaps that is what truly gives any place significance. You continue walking until you reach the outskirts of the city, where the desert begins, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. A caravan prepares to depart. Camels kneel patiently beside piles of cargo wrapped in cloth and leather, salt, spices, trade goods, and hidden carefully among them, manuscripts. Books once again, leaving Timbuktu to travel across the Sahara. The cycle continues. A young student you met days earlier notices you watching. "You are leaving?" he asks. You nod. He smiles gently before handing you a small folded scrap of parchment. "Then take this," he says. Inside, written in careful flowing script, are a few simple words. A city survives when its stories survive. You thank him quietly and tuck the parchment into your satchel beside the others you have gathered during your journey. The caravan finally begins moving, slowly, patiently, like time itself, crossing the desert. You take one final look back at Timbuktu. From a distance, the city almost disappears into the dunes once again. Its walls blend into the Sahara, as though trying not to disturb the landscape around it. A city built from earth, books, silence, and memory. The wind moves gently across the sand. Above you, the endless sky stretches quietly over caravan routes traveled for centuries by merchants, scholars, poets, teachers, and dreamers. People who believed knowledge mattered enough to carry across deserts, even when the world became uncertain, even when empires collapsed, even when libraries had to be hidden beneath floors and behind walls. You realize now that Timbuktu was never truly lost, only forgotten for a while. And perhaps that is different. The sun begins sinking lower as your caravan continues northward. The sounds of camel bells blend softly with the desert wind. Around you, travelers settle into silence beneath the growing evening sky. Somewhere far behind you, scribes still work beside candlelight. Teachers still recite lessons. Children still memorize poems. And hidden libraries still rest quietly beneath. The ancient streets of Timbuktu waiting patiently for future generations to remember them again. The stars slowly emerge overhead, one by one. The same stars that guided caravans centuries ago. The same stars scholars once studied from rooftops beside oil lamps. The same stars now shining softly above your own journey home. You close your eyes for a moment and breathe in the cool desert air. And as sleep finally begins pulling gently at your thoughts, you carry with you the quiet understanding that history is not only made by conquerors and kings. Sometimes it is protected by teachers, by storytellers, by scribes with ink-stained hands, by families hiding books beneath their floors, by ordinary people refusing to let memory disappear. The desert wind moves softly around you. The caravan continues onward through the night, and somewhere behind the dunes, the city of Timbuktu still waits quietly beneath the stars. remembering, good night.